Hello there and a very warm welcome to my brand new Project Management Primer. My name is Dave Litton and I'm delighted to have your company for the next 8 video modules. This, as you can see, is Module 1 and will be introducing you to the various aspects of the project procurement environment. But before we start, let me give you a very quick overview of the 8 modules themselves. Now, the purpose of this slide is merely to illustrate to you the various topics that you and I will cover over these 8 modules. Clearly this is the first module and you and I will be covering these elements of procurement. It is, however, worth pointing out that when we come to Module 3, I shall be taking a break from the various project procurement aspects at the all-important techniques and approaches you'll need to carry out successful negotiations. This, after all, often forms an important part of procurement, whether or not it is being carried out under a form of contract or not. The other point I'd like to make clear is that I've ensured that in terms of procurement, standard practices and terminology, you and I will be covering those most appropriate not just in the USA, but also within Europe as well. So that said, let's you and I make a start right away. Now, as you might imagine, procurement is a fairly specialist area, and it may well be in your organisation that you have a department that deals with aspects of procurement, including contractual activities. You may even have a company lawyer for such aspects. You'll need to become fairly familiar with some of the terminology that is used within the topic of project procurement. Okay, the first thing I need to bring your attention to is that the Procurement Strategy, which is a how-to document, and that in itself forms part of the overarching project management plan. So that just be aware, much like risk management and quality and what have you, you would have strategy documents explaining how those aspects will be applied and used within this particular project. And the so-called procurement strategy was no different in this regard. It was merely a how are we going to use procurement within this particular project. Some projects don't need any procurement at all, since it's only using internal staff. Now, the composition of the resource management plan is fairly straightforward. First off, the type of solution. Are you going to make it yourself internally? Are you going to buy it? Is it going to be an off-the-shelf product or service or what have you? And that's an important point. When we talk about procurement, we're talking about procuring products or services generally. The next section is the number of suppliers. You may have more than one. You may, for example, be using a third-party supplier for your power supply unit, and yet a different third party to write the software application, and so on and so forth. The supplier relationship, will come to the different relationships in a moment, but for now, one that you may almost certainly be familiar with is called a preferred supplier list, where as a result of your organisation needing certain products or services on a regular basis, then you will identify a supplier that you continually use simply because you know that they meet all of your requirements. Then how are you going to go about the supplier selection and the sources used to help make that choice? You can well imagine that some of the selection criteria might be the stability of the company, its product support, and so on and so forth. The terms and conditions and the type or form of contract. Again, I'm going to introduce you to several different types of contract and their terms and conditions, if you will. And the final section, normally within the resource management plan with regards to procurement, is the type of pricing used and the method of reimbursement. Yes, there's several types of those as well, and I shall be covering them later. So let's start at the top and give you a nice overview of the general procurement approach. Well, the first thing that needs to happen is you need to establish the user's need. Now, this will normally happen either at the very beginning of the project or possibly pre-project. And let me say right away that you may be procuring goods or services without the need of a project. But obviously you and I are interested in projects here, and hence the use of procurement within projects. So establishing the user's need may occur before the project is formally started. Survey the marketplace. You may well find that you would want to look at the different choices available to potentially find a supplier, and then to specify the requirements. So you can see these general 3 steps here. may well occur before the project actually starts. However, let's imagine the project has started. The first thing we want to do is to seek tenders for the supply of the products or services. Having found them, we need to in some way assess the tenders, those that are tendering to supply us with some products or services, for example, and then to choose the supplier out of all of those who have tendered. Then, of course, you would typically be in the development or implementation phase of your project, where you're creating your product or service. Again, let's suppose that you're buying in a power supply unit and getting a supplier to provide software. Then they would interface and be involved at the appropriate stage or work packages as part of you creating your product or service. Now, in some instances, you may be looking for a special build of a product, and in which case the contract will be for the supplier to create or modify or tailor one of their existing products or services. But let's keep it simple for the moment. This is your project. Here you've identified the supplier, and they are now working with you during the project to create their product or service along with yours. And typically at the end of the project, although it may occur during the project lifecycle, the goods, services or products need to be accepted into service. In other words, this is passing them into the business as usual or operational area. And normally this would occur at the end of the project. So these steps are typically after the project has finished. Now, the product or service is now in operational use, and typically it would need to be supported. Again, you may have a support and maintenance contract with a third party, or it may well be that your operational staff will need to keep the product or service maintained and operating as it should. Ultimately, however, there'll come a time when the product or service is decommissioned and disposed of. So a very high level picture here. The middle part is typically where the project is. This is typically before the project, although you could be specifying the requirements in the first phase of your project. And then this part here is after the project has completed. Okay, so let me get a few procurement definitions out of the way. They're not really hard. The term procurement is the first one that needs to be ironed out. Now, procurement is the process by which products and services are acquired from an external provider for incorporation into the project or into the program or the portfolio. So this is where you evaluate the tenders, just like we saw in the previous slide, to select the preferred supplier. In this case, it's the preferred supplier in this particular procurement, not, for example, a supplier which is on a special preferred supplier list, in which case you wouldn't need to tender it since they're already your preferred supplier. Another common term that you'll come across is the invitation to tender, as you saw in the previous slide, and this is a supplier's invitation to bid for the supply of specified goods or services. In other words, this is the buyer, if you will, saying, I'm interested in a certain type of product or service, and I'm inviting you to bid for it. And we'll look at all of the bids, and then we'll make a decision. The word tender means to prepare the document that proposes to meet the customer specification in a certain way at a stated price on a specified financial basis under stated conditions. In other words, the customer specification, that's the buyer, of course, here's what they're asking for, here's the price we're prepared to bid for, and in and around that price, here's the financial basis under stated conditions. These are your terms and conditions. And we'll learn all about the different ways that these conditions can be offered. Next up, the resource management plan, which is the name for the procurement strategy. This is for a particular project determining the most appropriate means of procuring the component parts or services of a project. Then we come to the contract itself. This is defined as a legally binding agreement between two parties. Contractor, this is normally the person, company or a firm who holds a contract for carrying out the works and or supply of goods or services to the project. So what we're generally talking about here is those that are contracted to provide goods or services to the project and would normally go through a tendering process. Don't confuse that with the term contractor, as you may have gone to an agency and you have some contractors working alongside with your permanent staff, for example, hardware or software engineers. But in this context, we're referring to, as it says, a person, company or firm who holds the contract for carrying out the works and or supply of goods or services for the project. Now, with regard to individuals who you may call contractors, They will also have a contract and terms and conditions, often offered through the agency that you used to identify and obtain them. Then we've got the supplier. This is the organisation, including contractors and consultants, who supplies goods or services. So it's the supplier that's being invited to tender. Okay? So these are the most common definitions. As we go through the remaining slides in this and the next module, you'll come across some more terminology which you need to understand. So what I'm doing here is showing the procurement flowchart similar to the first slide, but in this one I'm pointing out the two sides, the buyer and the supplier, and their organisations. So let me first of all give you a slightly more detailed definition of a contract. It's an agreement made between two or more parties that creates legally binding obligations between them. Now, the contract sets out those obligations and the actions that can be taken if they are not met. That's an important point. And it's a fact that the contract must lay down exactly what steps and actions are to be taken if either side don't agree that the terms of the contract have indeed been met. Now, so starting off with the client organisation, that's the buyer if you will, let's assume that's you and I working with inside our project, there's these steps. First of all, make the decision to do the project in the first place, and just after that point, the project manager will normally become involved, and then making a decision whether part of the project or all of the project will be subcontracted. And part of the decision-making criteria here is, are you going to make it in-house or buy it out? And it's not simply a whole make or a whole buy, if you will. You may be deciding which parts of the solution will you make and which parts, if any, will you buy or procure, if you will. Now you need to create the procurement strategy, now of course called the resource management plan, and with that done, you can issue your invitation to tender. Now looking on the supplier side, this is the contracting organisation. Let's assume that you have issued invitation to tender, usually done to more than one supplier. Therefore, that each supplier needs to make the decision, do they wish to tender for it or not? There may be many reasons why they don't. It may be they've got too much work on, not enough resources, or the product or service that you're asking them to tender for is not one they're particularly interested in. However, let's assume they are. They now create an estimated costed plan for the bid, along with the contract terms and conditions. They now bid for the business, and you'll learn later in this module about something called a bidders conference, where all of those who are tendering are present, and it's a place where questions can be asked and answers given, and creates a level playing field, if you will, so that everyone knows what everyone else does. So the next step would be to receive tenders from the various contracting organisations or suppliers that you've asked to make a tender, and to evaluate them. What we're obviously trying to do here is to choose which one is the best, and there will be several factors that will need to be taken into consideration here. It's not just a personal choice, it's often done against a set of agreed criteria. And by the way, when you issue an invitation to tender, that criteria must be known to each supplier, so they know what the criteria will be to choose them or not. So let's now assume the winning bid is chosen. We're on the client organisation side here, the buyer if you will. We now need to get both parties to negotiate. You see, once we've chosen them as the winning bid, there may be some negotiation to be done around the terms and conditions or the delivery mechanism. It could be anything. So there'll very often be some form of negotiation after the winning bid has been chosen. And by the way, I'll be covering negotiation in a separate and later module. Let's assume the negotiation went well, in which case the contract is signed. Well, maybe it's not time just yet for a party, but obviously winning a contract would be quite important from the supply side. And now the hard work starts, which is where the supplier needs to supply the goods and services that they promised that they would deliver. Keeping at a high level, the procurement process in summary, the resource management plan, which as you know is the procurement strategy. It's the how we're going to procure the goods and services for this particular project. It's the approach to the acquisition and management of an external supplier to provide goods or services, and how these goods or services will be acquired. So you're already fairly familiar with the steps from that overview diagram I first showed you, and we're going to start at the point where an invitation to tender is given out. That's step one, if you will. Prepare an invitation to tender or bid for the supply of goods or services. Step 2, each supplier will offer a tender document with a bid price under which the supplier is willing to undertake the customer's work. Step 3, just like before, the supplier is now selected, and what the buyer will do is to evaluate the various tenders and select the chosen supplier. There'll be some form of negotiation. As I've said, I'll be covering that in a later module, where agreement hopefully is reached on how the customer-supplier relationship will be carried out. And then the contract, of course, which is a legal and binding agreement in which the supplier is obligated to supply the goods or services, and on the customer side, they're obligated to pay for them. So the procurement approach is documented in the Resource Management Plan. And since this is such a central document, let me mention it one more time. It will, if you recall, the type of solution, whether it's make it in-house, buy it off the shelf, so on and so forth, the number of suppliers involved with the project, the type of contracting relationship you have with them, how you go about the selection of the right supplier and the sources of information that you use to do that, the contract conditions and the type of contract, and the pricing structure, along with the method of reimbursement. So make or buy, I've mentioned that a few times now. Make obviously means this will cover the costs of an in-house build. So to answer the question, should we make it ourselves or should we buy it via procurement, we'll need to weigh up the costs of an in-house build. We'll need to check and ensure that we have the right resources available. And this of course means knowledge, skills and experience, as well as simply people, as well as just the number of individuals. And resources could include non-human, such as facilities or manufacturing equipment and so on. The risks involved, and here we're looking at the risks of making it ourselves. It may well be resource availability is one of the risks, or the right level of skills and knowledge. Interestingly, it's often the case that the cost of an in-house build can be more expensive than contracting the work out, because often you'll contract it out to a supplier whose specialism is doing the type of work that you want done, and therefore they're pretty good at it, and they can usually come up with a more competitive price than using your in-house staff. And the organisational impacts. If you're going to make it yourself, you'll be tying up resources. Will this have an impact on other projects? So even if it was more expensive to outsource it rather than internal resources, it might be the best strategy to take from an organisational perspective, simply because it will free up staff for other projects which we wouldn't have the opportunity to do if we'd used them all on this one, if you see the point I'm making. So the make or buy decision isn't just flipping a coin, it's considering aspects such as these, and then looking for the same type of thing if you contracted it out. So here we want to compare the costs of the in-house build against the procurement direct costs, see which one's cheaper. And then of course procurement indirect costs, because obviously if we're just buying something via procurement, all we're doing is paying out money. There's no other impact to us other than the costs. One would hope, of course, that the third party can deliver the products or services at the time in which we would need them. So let's assume that having made the decision of make or buy, it's come down on the side of buying. In other words, yes, it makes sense. We shouldn't be making it in-house. Buying it out is the best decision. Then, of course, we come to the invitation to tender, sometimes shortened to ITT. And this is a formal document where, as you now know, you would give out to all those who wish to tender for your business. And the invitation tender should include the statement of requirements, exactly what it is you're asking for, any and all technical specification. For example, it may need to meet certain health and safety specifications. The general terms of the contract type if you will, and any special terms of the contract. These special terms would normally relate to the type of product or service that is being tendered for, and aspects such as financial, insurance, and of course the payment terms. So I've mentioned several times the different types of supplier relationships that you may have. Let's now look at the normal choices. There's something called arm's length. This is where there's minimal contact between both parties. Now that may seem rather strange, but very often it makes a lot of sense. For example, if you're procuring some products from the other side of the world, then clearly all you'd want to do is put your order in along with the terms and conditions, and once they've agreed, they'd get on and either manufacture them or modify them or what have you, and then deliver them. Another type is called partnering or forming some form of alliance, and/or joint venture or JVs. This normally occurs where there's a long-term commitment between both parties to achieve common objectives. Now, I started off working in the defence industry in the UK, and without mentioning names, there are several very large organisations that specialised in helping to create and provide products and services to the armed forces. And as part of the procurement arm, we knew who these large manufacturers were, so that for each project, we normally see the same phases, simply because it made sense. We both knew how each other worked, we knew that they were reliable and that their products were good and we could maintain them and so on and so forth. And from the supplier perspective, of course, the defence industry, if you will, was one of their biggest and most important customers. So very often we formed some form of partnering agreement or joint venture with them. However, just talking about this generally now, this can vary from an alliance on one project to forming a new venture company to develop new products or facilities. Yes, that could happen. So, arm's length or partnering, forming an alliance or joint venture. Another type I've mentioned already, called the preferred supplier. This again is the result of a close long-term relationship. And in my little bit of clip art here, you can see I've shown batteries, even something as simple as that. You may find that you get very good discounts, prompt service delivery, and so on and so forth from someone who supplies batteries to your particular organisation. They may not be simple things like this that go in calculators and torches. They may be more complex batteries, such as those used on aircraft. So a preferred supplier would be on a preferred supplier list. And if you have a contracts branch or department, they would keep this list up to date. So that if your project needed, for example, some specialty type batteries, then they would be able to advise you who you should be using. So often used for supply of key goods, depending on your main products or services of your organisation. And very often a seller, that's the supplier by the way, account manager, is normally appointed to help foster the relationship and grow the business between both parties. So if you do use a certain make of batteries from a supplier, then they will have an account manager whose name is well known and of whom we've both developed a good working relationship. The other type is called a turnkey supplier. Now, in this case, the supplier provides a complete solution which is deployed so that the buyer can simply turn the key to use. So what turnkey refers to is a complete end-to-end solution. Very often you'll find that a contract is to provide certain products which need to be installed in part of your larger system, whereas a turnkey is they are providing the entire system, hence the term turnkey. Okay, so there's 4 typical supplier contractual relationships. Let's move on and look at contract terms next. Now, what the terms, or terms and conditions if you will, are what payment terms will best motivate all parties. You see, what we're looking for is a win-win solution. Although you'll always be talking about getting a contract for the cheapest option, and we really got them over a barrel, that would not be best for a long-term relationship. So back to the term contract. A contract is an agreement made between 2 or more parties that creates legally binding obligations between both of them. And the contract sets out those obligations and the actions that can be taken if they're not met. So I'm repeating these 2 phrases here so you can keep them front of mind while we talk about different contract terms. Starting with off-the-shelf buys, just like you going to a supermarket and buying a box of your favourite breakfast cereal. This is a simple, quick and low-risk approach. Why? Because it's off the shelf. It's something that the manufacturer makes regularly for many of their customers, and therefore it's available already pre-built off the shelf. So simple, quick and low risk. All you've got to do is to buy it from them so that they can ship it back to you. Something called key point specifications. This is a way of meeting requirements by adapting existing designs, but in other words by laying down the key point specifications. It must do that, it must comply with this, and so on and so forth. So that this terminology is used when you choose to specify the requirements using the minimum key points. We've covered in the previous slide partnering and forming an alliance. This is typically outsourcing of non-core activities to third parties with appropriate specialist skills, as in the example that I gave in the previous slide of manufacturers supplying products and services to the defence industry. Turnkey or comprehensive contract We looked at that in the previous slide. This is the simplest form of contract where one supplier, and one supplier only, is responsible for everything contained within the project. A good example here might be a specialist software vendor that supplies a complete software solution via a system which has a built-in application along with hardware. A point of sale terminal might be a good example here. Imagine if you were a very large supermarket with various outlets throughout the UK, let's imagine, then you may well bid for a point of sale solution from a manufacturer, and that solution will be replicated in all of your stores throughout the UK. And in which case, that supplier would normally not only install it and make sure it works, but also maintain and update it, all part of a contract. Then there's parallel contracts, in other words, more than one being operated at the same time. This is where the customer, the buyer, yourself if you will, obtains goods and services from and communicates to a range of suppliers. In other words, parallel contracts is another way of saying we've got more than one contract, let's say on this project. A subcontract is where a main supplier, called the prime, is chosen and they subcontract parts of the requirements to others. Again, this is quite natural and normal. If the contractor is building or designing a system for your use, either forming the whole of the project or part of it, they'll almost certainly outsource some very specific parts, for example documentation, user guides and such, or making of metal or specialist type chassis or enclosures for the solution that they're providing to you. Now we come on to different types of payment terms. This is quite a powerful diagram, as you will see. So what we've got here so far is at the top here, we've got risks to the supplier. That's the person who's supplying the goods or services. This end of the continuum, we have low risk to the supplier. This end, high risk to the supplier. Down the bottom here, risk to the customer, or the buyer if you will. High risk this end and low risk that end. Notice there the reverse. Now looking at the different types of contract, which I'll be covering on the next and final module of procurement, we'll learn that there's something called time and materials. Another name for this is unit price. And when you're using time and materials, any cost overrun risk is with the client, in other words, the customer. So time and materials is fairly high risk to the customer, simply because they'll have to pay for any overruns. Next up is the cost plus payment terms. Again, I'll discuss all of this in the next module, so you'll be absolutely clear of what this is. But I feel it's important for you to see this overview slide first. This is slightly more risky to the supplier and slightly less risky to the customer, because the supplier gets to charge, if you will, the costs that are incurred plus a fixed fee, or costs plus a percentage of the fee. In other words, a cost plus type contract is still a good deal to the supplier and less so to the customer. But let's look at as the balance starts to change here, starting with target cost or price contract. This is where a target price is agreed up front before the contract is let, if you will, and any over or underperformance is shared by both parties at an agreed rate. So in this case, if the contract is not fully met, the supplier will take some of the heat as well as the customer. But generally the customer would come off better here, since most suppliers do not want to underperform. So in a target cost price contract, the supply side will be working very hard to make sure the contract is acceptable. And at the extreme end, where the risk to the customer are very low, and they're certainly high for the supplier, is called fixed price. Now, as you might imagine, fixed price contracts tend to cost more to include supplier cost overrun risks. In other words, if you set a fixed price contract, you say to the supplier, this is what I'm paying you, this and no more. Now off you go and make these products and services, but don't come running to me if you find it's more expensive to make than you first thought, or you've made some mistakes and you need to do some rework, or whatever. So fixed price is good from the customer perspective, and it's quite risky from the supplier. Quite the reverse, if you will, from good old time and materials. Imagine if you've asked a gardener to come to your garden and to landscape it, and they charge you time and materials. Well, they might promise you they can get this done within a few days. Here are the products that they'll be buying for you, like setting up a water fountain, planting some mature trees and building a patio, and so on and so forth. But if they're on time and materials, once they start work and then you realise that they couldn't get the discounts they were hoping for on the sand and cement, and the hiring costs for the digger was more than expected, and to meet the time frame that you asked for, they had to work overtime. And you can imagine all of the reasons that come out of the woodwork. So time and materials is not good news. Okay, so on the next module we'll be looking at all of these in more detail. For now though, I just want to finally finish off by talking about a bidders conference. Now this is normally a mandatory requirement to ensure that the tendering process is, keyword, seen by all to be open and fair. Now it may not be as grand as this graphic tends to suggest, but for large procurements this may be typical. Each of the suppliers would all be present in the room, and normally some form of presentation is done by the customer or buyer, and the suppliers will have all had copies of the tender document, and here they can ask any questions, and let's imagine this is you, the customer or buyer, would need to answer those, and by answering that question to one supplier, all of the suppliers get the same information. So it's a good way of ensuring a level playing field where everyone is involved. Now, the way in which these normally are held is they'll have a first session kick-off and then a break, and in the break the various different suppliers, and by the way, typically you may have 2 or 3 individuals from the same supply side, will have a conversation, and then at the second half come back in and then bring up some new points that they want clarified. So it's usually a very efficient method of working, but a bidders conference need only last half a day. After all, the specification laid out in the tender document should be clear and obvious and unambiguous. But the objective here in a bidders conference is to make sure that everyone has got the same chance of bidding for the business, and that no one feels that they were left out of the loop or they didn't have all the information that the winning supplier had. In fact, having gone through this myself as the chairperson, very often you'll find you get emails or phone calls from some of the suppliers seeking clarification about a certain aspect. Now, if this is before the bidders conference, I would ask them to wait and I'll clarify it at the conference. But if it's afterwards, and it may well be quite normal that they determine there's some question that they didn't feel that they understood or didn't come out at the conference itself. So let's imagine I respond via email. I would respond to them and copy all of the other individuals present at that conference. In other words, I would start the email off by saying, I've had a question regarding blah 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 from supplier X, and I've given them a full answer. Please find it below and use it as part of preparing for your individual bids. So, there will nearly always be questions about ambiguities and different interpretation regarding the documentation provided, and the bidders conference allows open answers to be given to all. All bidders must be given exactly the same information upon which to generate their bid. So it may well be, if your procurement is fairly straightforward, that you may not have a physical bidders conference, but you may do the whole thing via email because that's most appropriate. But there's no doubt about it, having everyone sat around in the same room face to face is a very efficient and effective way to clarify points quickly and easily. After all, normally such tenders are given out and there's quite an aggressive timescale by which each supplier has got to give their response in time. So a bidders conference can get it all done, as I say, typically in a morning. Good. Well, that brings us to an end of Module 1. Thank you for your time and attention, and do join me on Module 2 when you and I will be looking at payment structures and suppliers. So from me, Dave Litton, it's bye for now.